The emergency broadcast crackled through Marcus Thompson's radio as he worked late in his downtown office building, the static-filled voice barely audible over the hum of fluorescent lights. Reports of violent incidents across the metropolitan area continued to escalate, the announcer's strained voice echoed through the empty corridors. Authorities are advising all citizens to remain indoors and avoid contact with individuals displaying erratic behavior. Marcus paused from organizing his files, his brow furrowing as he glanced toward the window overlooking the city streets below. The usual evening traffic had thinned to an unusual degree, and an eerie silence seemed to blanket the normally bustling downtown district. 3 blocks away, Detective Riley Martinez was responding to what dispatch had described as a domestic disturbance with multiple casualties. But as she approached the suburban home with her partner, Officer Jake Williams, the scene that greeted them defied every protocol they had learned at the academy. The front door hung askew on its hinges, and dark stains painted the white porch in irregular patterns that caught the dying light of the setting sun. Inside, they discovered the Henderson family, or what remained of them, scattered throughout their once peaceful living room in a tableau of violence that neither officer could immediately comprehend. The youngest daughter, Emma Henderson, cowered behind an overturned couch, her eyes wide with terror as she whispered about her father changing and attacking her mother with an inhuman ferocity that seemed impossible for the mild-mannered accountant they had known from community events. Meanwhile, across town at Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Amanda Foster was struggling to make sense of the influx of patients arriving with bite wounds and lacerations that defied medical explanation. The victims spoke in fragmented sentences about family members and neighbors who had suddenly turned violent, their eyes vacant and their movements unnaturally aggressive. Nurse practitioner David Chen worked alongside her, documenting symptoms that seemed to follow no known pattern of infection or psychological break. The patients who had been bitten displayed a rapid onset of fever, followed by periods of delirium where they would attempt to attack anyone who came near them, requiring restraints that the hospital was rapidly running short of. As the evening progressed, the emergency room became a chaotic symphony of screams, medical equipment alarms, and the constant shuffle of overwhelmed staff trying to maintain order in an increasingly desperate situation. The hospital's security team, led by former military veteran Captain Robert Hayes, found themselves dealing with situations far beyond their usual scope of drunk patients and minor altercations. In the suburbs, high school teacher Jennifer Walsh was preparing dinner for her family when her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, appeared at her kitchen window with an expression that sent chills down Jennifer's spine. The elderly woman's usually kind eyes had become clouded and unfocused, and her gentle demeanor had been replaced by something predatory and wrong. Jennifer's husband, Michael, a construction foreman who had seen his share of workplace accidents, immediately recognized that something was fundamentally different about their neighbor's condition. As Mrs. Patterson began clawing at the window with increasing intensity, leaving bloody streaks on the glass, the Walsh family realized that the strange news reports they had been hearing throughout the day were not isolated incidents but part of something much larger and more terrifying. Their teenage son, Tyler, frantically searched social media for answers, finding scattered posts and videos from across the city showing similar scenes of ordinary people transformed into something monstrous and violent. The transformation seemed to follow a pattern that became increasingly clear as the night wore on. Those who had been bitten or scratched by the affected individuals would develop symptoms within hours, beginning with a high fever and progressing to a complete loss of higher brain function while retaining basic motor skills and an overwhelming compulsion to attack the uninfected. Communication became impossible with the affected, as they seemed incapable of speech or recognition of former relationships, responding only to the presence of potential victims with single-minded aggression. As emergency services became overwhelmed and communication networks began to fail under the strain of panicked calls, small groups of survivors found themselves isolated and forced to rely on their own resources and ingenuity to survive the night. The city that had been their home for years suddenly became an alien landscape filled with dangers they could never have imagined, where every shadow might conceal a former friend or family member transformed into something that no longer recognized the bonds of human connection, setting the stage for a struggle that would test the very limits of human resilience and adaptability. As dawn broke over the city, the full scope of the catastrophe became horrifyingly clear to the scattered groups of survivors who had managed to endure the night. Marcus Thompson had barricaded himself in his office building's security room, using the building's camera system to witness the transformation of his familiar downtown district into a nightmare landscape. The streets below teemed with figures that moved with an unnatural gait, their clothing torn and stained, wandering aimlessly until they detected movement or sound that would send them into a frenzied pursuit. From his elevated vantage point, Marcus watched in horror as a delivery truck driver, apparently unaware of the danger, stepped out of his vehicle only to be immediately swarmed by a group of the infected who had been drawn by the sound of his engine. The man's screams echoed through the concrete canyon of buildings before being abruptly silenced, and within minutes, Marcus observed the driver rising again, his movements now matching the jerky, predatory motions of his attackers. The realization that the infection was spreading through direct contact sent a chill through Marcus as he calculated how quickly the entire city could be overrun if the pattern continued unchecked. Detective Martinez and Officer Williams had spent the night trapped in their patrol car, surrounded by infected individuals who had been drawn to the vehicle's flashing lights and radio chatter. The two officers had been forced to make the difficult decision to abandon their post and seek shelter, but every attempt to reach their precinct had been thwarted by growing crowds of the infected who seemed to appear from every direction. Riley's police training had prepared her for many dangerous situations, but nothing in her experience had equipped her to deal with adversaries who felt no pain, showed no fear, and could only be stopped by complete incapacitation. Jake, younger and less experienced, struggled with the psychological impact of recognizing former community members among the infected, including the local grocery store clerk who had always greeted him with a friendly smile and now clawed desperately at their car windows with blood-stained fingers. Their radio crackled with increasingly desperate calls from other units, painting a picture of a citywide emergency that was rapidly spiraling beyond the capacity of law enforcement to contain. At Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Foster and her team faced an impossible situation as the number of infected patients began to outnumber the healthy staff. The hospital's isolation protocols, designed for traditional infectious diseases, proved woefully inadequate against patients who actively sought to attack anyone within reach. David Chin had been forced to make the heartbreaking decision to sedate several patients who had turned violent, but the hospital's supply of restraints and sedatives was rapidly depleting. Captain Hayes and his security team found themselves essentially fighting a war within the hospital corridors, using whatever makeshift weapons they could find to protect the remaining staff and uninfected patients. The hospital's backup generators hummed ominously as the main power grid began to fail across sections of the city, casting long shadows through the medical facility that seemed to hide dangers around every corner. Dr. Foster realized that their position was becoming untenable as infected individuals from outside began to gather around the hospital, drawn by the lights and sounds of activity within. The Walsh family had transformed their suburban home into a fortress, using furniture and tools from Michael's workshop to reinforce doors and windows against the growing number of infected neighbors who wandered through their once peaceful subdivision. Jennifer's teacher instincts kicked in as she organized their limited supplies and created a system for monitoring the surrounding area, while Tyler used his technological skills to maintain contact with other survivor groups through social media platforms that were still functioning sporadically. Michael's construction experience proved invaluable as he identified structural weaknesses in their defenses and worked to shore them up using materials salvaged from their garage and basement. The family discovered that the infected were drawn to sound and movement, leading them to develop a system of silent communication and carefully planned movements that minimized their chances of detection. As they watched their neighborhood transform from a place of safety and community into a hunting ground for the infected, the Walsh family began to understand that their survival would depend not just on avoiding the immediate threat, but on adapting to a fundamentally changed world where the rules of civilization no longer applied. Throughout the city, similar scenes played out as ordinary people found themselves thrust into extraordinary circumstances that tested their resourcefulness, courage, and humanity. The infection continued its relentless spread, turning friends into enemies and safe spaces into death traps, while the survivors learned harsh lessons about the fragility of the society they had taken for granted and the primal instincts that emerged when civilization's protective barriers crumbled away. By the third day, the city had become a patchwork of isolated survivor enclaves separated by vast territories controlled by the infected, who had begun to display increasingly organized behavior that chilled the remaining human population to their core. Marcus Thompson had established contact with other survivors through the building's emergency communication system, discovering that several office buildings in the downtown area still housed small groups of people who had managed to secure their positions. Among these was Elena Rodriguez, a software engineer who had been working late in the adjacent tower when the outbreak began, and who had used her technical expertise to create a network of communication between the various survivor groups. Through Elena's improvised system, Marcus learned that the infected were no longer wandering randomly but seemed to be forming loose congregations that moved with a disturbing sense of purpose, as if some primitive intelligence was beginning to emerge from their collective behavior. The downtown survivors had observed these groups systematically searching buildings, breaking down barriers that had previously kept them at bay, and displaying a level of persistence that suggested they retained some capacity for problem-solving despite their apparent loss of higher cognitive function. Detective Martinez and Officer Williams had managed to reach the abandoned police precinct, only to discover that most of their colleagues had either fled the city or fallen victim to the infection during the chaotic first night. The building's armory provided them with additional weapons and ammunition, but Riley quickly realized that their traditional law enforcement tactics were useless against an enemy that could not be reasoned with, arrested, or deterred through conventional means. Jake had struggled with the psychological toll of their situation, particularly after they encountered their former captain among a group of infected that had gathered in the precinct's parking lot, forcing them to make decisions that went against every principle of their training. The two officers began developing new strategies for movement and engagement, learning to use the infected's attraction to sound and movement as a tactical advantage while conserving their limited ammunition for situations where escape was impossible. Their radio equipment allowed them to monitor emergency frequencies, revealing that similar outbreaks were occurring in cities across the region, suggesting that whatever had caused the initial infection was far more widespread than anyone had initially realized. The situation at Mercy General Hospital had deteriorated to the point where Dr. Foster and the remaining staff were forced to abandon the lower floors entirely, retreating to the upper levels where they could better control access points and maintain a defensive perimeter. David Chin had taken on the role of coordinating the medical team's survival efforts, using his knowledge of the hospital's layout and systems to identify secure areas where they could continue treating the few remaining uninfected patients. Captain Hayes had organized the security personnel and volunteer staff members into shifts that maintained constant vigilance against the infected who had overrun much of the hospital's ground floor, their moans and shuffling footsteps creating a constant soundtrack of dread that echoed through the building's corridors. The medical team had made the difficult decision to euthanize patients who showed signs of infection, a choice that weighed heavily on their consciences but seemed necessary to prevent the spread within their diminished safe zone. Dr. Foster found herself grappling with ethical dilemmas that no medical school had prepared her for, as traditional concepts of patient care and the Hippocratic Oath seemed inadequate in a world where saving one life might mean condemning others to a fate worse than death. The Walsh family had been forced to abandon their home after a large group of infected had surrounded the building, drawn by the sound of their generator and the scent of cooking food that had carried farther than they had anticipated. Michael's quick thinking and construction knowledge had enabled them to escape through a basement tunnel that connected to the storm drain system, carrying only essential supplies and weapons they had improvised from household items. Jennifer's organizational skills proved crucial as she managed their limited resources and maintained the family's morale during their harrowing journey through the underground passages, while Tyler used his smartphone's remaining battery life to navigate the tunnel system and identify potential exit points that might lead to safer territory. The family emerged several miles from their neighborhood, finding themselves in an industrial district where the infected presence seemed less concentrated, possibly due to the area's lack of residential population during the initial outbreak. As they searched for a new shelter, the Walsh family encountered other survivor groups, including a family of immigrants led by Carlos Mendoza, a mechanic whose practical skills and knowledge of the area's geography made him a valuable ally in their struggle for survival. The growing network of survivor communities began to share information about the infected's behavior patterns, discovering that the creatures were most active during certain times of day and seemed to be drawn to specific types of stimuli, knowledge that would prove essential for anyone hoping to survive in the transformed landscape that their world had become. The fourth day brought a devastating revelation that shattered any remaining hope for a quick resolution to the crisis, as survivor groups across the city began to report that the infected were not only maintaining their numbers but actually increasing them through a process that defied all previous understanding of the outbreak. Marcus Thompson watched in horror from his office building as a massive horde of infected individuals moved through the downtown streets with a coordination that suggested they were being guided by some form of collective intelligence. Elena Rodriguez had managed to establish contact with military frequencies, only to learn that evacuation efforts had been suspended indefinitely after several rescue operations had resulted in the loss of entire units to the infected swarms. The military communications revealed that similar outbreaks had occurred simultaneously in major population centers across the continent, overwhelming government response capabilities and forcing authorities to implement containment protocols that essentially wrote off entire metropolitan areas. Marcus and Elena realized that they were truly on their own, with no prospect of outside assistance and dwindling supplies that would force them to venture into the infected-controlled streets within days. Detective Martinez and Officer Williams had discovered evidence at the police station that suggested the outbreak's origins were far from natural, finding classified documents that referenced biological research facilities and containment breaches that had occurred in the days leading up to the first reported incidents. Riley's investigation revealed a pattern of cover-ups and failed containment efforts that painted a picture of institutional incompetence and deliberate misinformation that had prevented effective early response to the crisis. Jake struggled with the implications of their discoveries, particularly the realization that law enforcement agencies had been kept in the dark about the true nature of the threat they were facing, leaving them unprepared and vulnerable when the outbreak reached critical mass. The two officers made the difficult decision to abandon their official duties and focus solely on survival, recognizing that their oath to serve and protect had become meaningless in a world where the very concept of law and order had collapsed. Their exploration of the city revealed that certain areas seemed to be completely devoid of infected, creating safe corridors that suggested the creatures were avoiding specific locations for reasons that remained unclear but offered potential opportunities for survivor movement and resource gathering. At Mercy General Hospital, the medical team faced their darkest hour when Dr. Foster discovered that several staff members who had been treating infected patients were beginning to show early symptoms of the condition, despite having followed all known safety protocols. David Chen's analysis of blood samples from infected patients revealed disturbing anomalies that suggested the pathogen responsible for the outbreak was unlike any known biological agent, displaying characteristics that seemed to defy conventional understanding of viral or bacterial transmission. Captain Hayes was forced to make the heartbreaking decision to quarantine the affected staff members, knowing that their transformation was inevitable but hoping to prevent the complete collapse of their defensive position. The hospital's upper floors had become a microcosm of the larger struggle for survival, with limited resources forcing impossible choices about who could be saved and who would have to be sacrificed for the greater good. Dr. Foster found herself questioning everything she had believed about medicine and human nature as she watched colleagues and patients succumb to an enemy that seemed to target the very essence of what made them human, leaving behind only the shell of their former selves driven by an insatiable hunger for living flesh. The Walsh family and their new allies had established a temporary base in an abandoned warehouse, where Carlos Mendoza's mechanical expertise had enabled them to fortify the building and create early warning systems that would alert them to approaching infected groups. Jennifer's teaching background proved invaluable as she organized the diverse group of survivors into an efficient community, assigning roles and responsibilities that maximized their collective skills while maintaining the morale necessary for long-term survival. Tyler had become the group's intelligence gatherer, using his technological knowledge to monitor radio frequencies and social media platforms for information about other survivor communities and safe zones. Michael's construction experience was put to use creating defensive barriers and escape routes, while Carlos worked on maintaining and modifying vehicles that would be essential for future supply runs and potential evacuation scenarios. The warehouse group had begun to attract other survivors, growing from a handful of individuals to a community of nearly 30 people who brought diverse skills and perspectives to their collective survival effort. However, their growing numbers also increased their resource requirements and made them more visible to the infected hordes that continued to patrol the surrounding area with increasing frequency and apparent intelligence. As the fourth day drew to a close, all the survivor groups faced the same grim reality. The infected were not simply mindless monsters but were evolving into something far more dangerous, and the battle for humanity's survival was only beginning to reveal its true scope and complexity. The fifth day marked a crucial turning point as the scattered survivor groups began to understand that their individual efforts, while heroic, would ultimately prove insufficient against the evolving threat that surrounded them on all sides. Marcus Thompson and Elena Rodriguez had spent hours analyzing the movement patterns of the infected hordes from their elevated position, discovering that the creatures followed predictable routes that suggested they were systematically searching every building in expanding circles from what appeared to be central gathering points. Elena's technical skills had enabled her to tap into the city's remaining surveillance network, providing a bird's-eye view of the infected's behavior that revealed disturbing evidence of tactical coordination among groups that had previously seemed to act on pure instinct. The downtown survivors made the difficult decision to abandon their individual strongholds and attempt a dangerous journey to unite with other survivor communities, recognizing that their isolated positions would eventually be overrun by the sheer numbers of infected that continued to pour into the urban center. Marcus volunteered to lead a reconnaissance mission to establish contact with the warehouse group that Tyler Walsh had been communicating with through social media, carrying with him detailed maps of safe routes and infected concentration areas that Elena had compiled from their surveillance data. Detective Martinez and Officer Williams had transformed their police station into an intelligence hub, using their law enforcement resources to coordinate communication between various survivor groups and share critical information about infected behavior patterns and safe passage routes. Riley's investigative skills had uncovered evidence that the infected were not randomly distributed throughout the city but seemed to be avoiding certain industrial areas where chemical plants and manufacturing facilities were located, suggesting that specific environmental factors might be deterring their presence. Jake had overcome his initial psychological trauma and developed into an effective scout, using his knowledge of the city's layout and his police training to map safe corridors and identify resource caches that could support larger survivor communities. The two officers had established contact with a group of firefighters who had barricaded themselves in Station 19, led by Captain Lisa Morgan, whose emergency response experience and access to specialized equipment made her team valuable allies in the growing network of survivor communities. Together, they began planning coordinated supply runs and rescue operations that would require precise timing and communication to avoid the infected patrols that had become increasingly sophisticated in their hunting strategies. The medical team at Mercy General Hospital faced a breakthrough when Dr. Foster discovered that certain medications seemed to slow the progression of infection symptoms in recently bitten patients, providing a narrow window of opportunity for treatment that could potentially save lives if administered quickly enough. David Shin had been working around the clock to analyze blood samples and tissue specimens, identifying cellular changes that occurred during the infection process and developing protocols that might prevent or delay the transformation that had claimed so many victims. Captain Hayes had successfully established contact with other survivor groups through the hospital's emergency radio system, sharing medical intelligence that proved crucial for communities dealing with infected members or treating bite wounds. The hospital team made the strategic decision to relocate their operations to a smaller, more defensible medical clinic in the suburbs, where they could continue their research while maintaining better security and easier access to supply routes. Dr. Foster's medical expertise had become a valuable commodity in the post-outbreak world, with survivor communities offering protection and resources in exchange for medical care and knowledge about infection prevention and treatment. The warehouse community had grown into a well-organized settlement under the combined leadership of the Walsh family and Carlos Mendoza, with nearly 50 survivors who had brought diverse skills ranging from military experience to agricultural knowledge that would be essential for long-term survival. Jennifer Walsh had established educational programs for the children in the group, maintaining some semblance of normalcy while teaching practical survival skills that would be necessary in their changed world. Tyler had become the community's communication specialist, maintaining contact with other survivor groups and coordinating the exchange of information about safe zones, resource locations, and infected movement patterns. Michael and Carlos had worked together to create an impressive defensive perimeter around the warehouse, complete with early warning systems, escape routes, and weapon caches that could support the community during extended sieges. The warehouse group had begun sending out carefully planned expeditions to rescue isolated survivors and gather supplies from abandoned stores and homes, operations that required precise coordination and split-second timing to avoid the infected patrols that had become increasingly aggressive and numerous. As the various survivor communities began to establish regular communication and coordinate their activities, they discovered that their combined knowledge and resources created possibilities for resistance that none of them could have achieved alone. The infected might have superior numbers and relentless determination, but the human survivors possessed intelligence, adaptability, and the capacity for cooperation that would prove to be their greatest weapons in the ongoing struggle for survival. The fifth day ended with the first successful joint operation between multiple survivor groups, a coordinated supply run that demonstrated the potential for organized resistance against the infected hordes that continued to threaten the remnants of human civilization. The sixth day dawned with an unprecedented level of coordination among the survivor communities, as the various groups implemented their first large-scale offensive operation designed to reclaim strategic territory and establish secure supply lines between their settlements. Marcus Thompson had successfully reached the warehouse community during the night, bringing with him detailed intelligence about infected movement patterns and the locations of other survivor groups that Elena Rodriguez had compiled from their surveillance network. The combined leadership of all the survivor communities had spent hours developing a comprehensive plan that would simultaneously strike at multiple infected gathering points while establishing permanent communication relays and supply depots throughout the reclaimed territory. Jennifer Walsh coordinated the overall strategy from the warehouse base, using her organizational skills to manage the complex logistics of moving people and equipment across a city filled with deadly threats, while Carlos Mendoza supervised the mechanical preparation of vehicles and equipment that would be essential for the operation's success. Detective Martinez and Officer Williams led a strike team composed of survivors with military and law enforcement backgrounds, targeting the infected concentration near the downtown financial district where the creatures had established what appeared to be a central coordination point for their activities. Riley's tactical planning had identified the optimal approach routes and timing for the assault, while Jake coordinated with Captain Lisa Morgan's firefighter team to provide support and evacuation capabilities for the operation. The strike team discovered that the infected had been gathering in the underground parking structures and subway tunnels, creating a network of passages that allowed them to move unseen throughout the city center and coordinate their attacks on survivor positions. The assault required careful use of explosives and incendiary devices to collapse key tunnel entrances and disrupt the infected's ability to mass their forces, operations that demanded precise timing to avoid trapping the human assault teams in the underground maze with thousands of hostile creatures. Dr. Foster and David Chin had established a mobile medical unit that followed the assault teams, providing immediate treatment for injuries and administering their experimental infection prevention protocols to anyone who had been exposed to infected bodily fluids during the fighting. The medical team's research had revealed that the infection could be prevented or significantly delayed if specific antiviral medications were administered within the first hour after exposure, knowledge that proved crucial for maintaining the assault team's effectiveness during extended combat operations. Captain Hayes had organized a security perimeter around the medical unit, using his military experience to coordinate defensive positions that could protect the medical personnel while they worked to save lives in the middle of active combat zones. The hospital team's mobile operations represented a significant advancement in the survivors' capabilities, allowing them to conduct extended operations away from their base while maintaining the medical support necessary to treat combat injuries and prevent infection spread among their forces. The warehouse community served as the central command post for the operation, with Tyler Walsh managing communications between all the various teams and monitoring the progress of each phase of the assault through his network of radio contacts and surveillance feeds. Michael Walsh and Carlos Mendoza had prepared multiple backup plans and escape routes for each team, recognizing that the operation's success would depend on their ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances and extract their people if any phase of the plan encountered unexpected resistance. The warehouse defenders maintained a strong security presence to protect the command post and provide a safe rally point for teams that might need to retreat and regroup during the operation. Elena Rodriguez had remained at her downtown observation post, using the building's surveillance systems to provide real-time intelligence about infected movements and alert the assault teams to potential threats or opportunities that emerged during the fighting. The coordinated assault achieved remarkable success, with the strike teams managing to eliminate several major infected gathering points and establish secure corridors that connected the various survivor communities for the first time since the outbreak began. The operation revealed that the infected, despite their apparent coordination, were vulnerable to well-planned attacks that disrupted their communication and movement patterns, suggesting that organized human resistance could potentially reclaim significant territory if properly coordinated and supplied. However, the assault also demonstrated the enormous risks involved in direct confrontation with the infected, as several team members were lost during the fighting and others sustained injuries that would require extended medical care and rehabilitation. The survivors discovered that their enemy was capable of learning from their tactics and adapting their behavior in response to human resistance, indicating that future operations would need to be even more sophisticated and unpredictable to maintain their effectiveness. As the sixth day concluded, the survivor communities had achieved their first major victory against the infected hordes, but they also understood that their success had likely provoked a response that would test their defenses and resolve in ways they had not yet experienced, setting the stage for an escalation in the conflict that would determine whether humanity could truly reclaim their world from the creatures that had overrun it. The seventh day brought both triumph and sobering reality as the survivor communities faced the consequences of their successful counterstrike while grappling with the long-term implications of their transformed world. The coordinated assault had achieved far more than anyone had dared hope, with the elimination of key infected gathering points creating a significant reduction in the creature's ability to mount organized attacks against the human settlements. Marcus Thompson and Elena Rodriguez had established a permanent observation and communication center in the reclaimed downtown area, providing the survivor network with unprecedented intelligence capabilities and early warning systems that could detect infected movements across the entire metropolitan region. The success of their technological surveillance network had revealed that the infected population was not infinite, and that sustained pressure from organized human resistance could potentially drive them back to manageable numbers, offering the first real hope for long-term survival and eventual recovery of their civilization. Detective Martinez and Officer Williams had taken on the role of training new recruits from among the survivor communities, sharing their tactical knowledge and combat experience with civilians who had never imagined they would need to fight for their lives against former neighbors and family members. Riley's law enforcement background proved invaluable in establishing protocols for security, resource distribution, and conflict resolution within the growing survivor settlements, while Jake's experience with community policing helped maintain morale and cooperation among groups of people who had been thrust together by circumstances beyond their control. Captain Lisa Morgan's firefighter team had become the backbone of the survivor community's emergency response capabilities, using their specialized equipment and training to handle everything from medical emergencies to structural engineering projects that were essential for expanding and fortifying their settlements. The combined emergency services personnel had created a new form of civil authority that balanced the need for security and discipline with the democratic principles that the survivors were determined to preserve despite the collapse of traditional government structures. Dr. Foster and David Chin had made breakthrough discoveries about the infection that offered hope for both treatment and prevention, developing protocols that could reliably prevent transformation if administered within the critical window after exposure. The medical team's research had revealed that the pathogen responsible for the outbreak was beginning to weaken over time, suggesting that the infected population might eventually become less dangerous as the biological agent that controlled them degraded naturally. Captain Hayes had established a medical training program that taught basic infection prevention and treatment techniques to members of all survivor communities, ensuring that life-saving knowledge would be preserved and distributed even if the medical professionals were lost. The hospital team's mobile medical units had become a crucial component of the survivor network's expansion efforts, allowing them to safely explore and reclaim territory while providing immediate medical support for rescue operations and combat missions. The warehouse community had evolved into the de facto capital of the survivor network, with Jennifer Walsh serving as the coordinator for intercommunity relations and resource-sharing agreements that ensured fair distribution of supplies and mutual support during emergencies. Tyler Walsh had expanded his communication network to include survivor communities in other cities, discovering that similar resistance movements were emerging across the continent and sharing strategies and intelligence that strengthened everyone's chances of survival. Michael Walsh and Carlos Mendoza had developed standardized fortification and defense plans that could be quickly implemented by new survivor communities, creating a network of mutually supporting settlements that could coordinate their defenses and share resources efficiently. The warehouse settlement had become a model for post-outbreak civilization, demonstrating that human society could adapt and rebuild even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. As the survivor communities looked toward the future, they understood that their world had been permanently changed by the outbreak, but they had also proven that human resilience, intelligence, and cooperation could overcome even the most devastating catastrophes. The infected remained a constant threat that would require ongoing vigilance and military action, but the establishment of secure territories and effective defense networks had created the foundation for a new form of civilization that incorporated the hard-learned lessons of survival while preserving the values and knowledge that made them human. The children in the survivor communities were already adapting to their new reality, learning skills and developing perspectives that would serve them well in a world where self-reliance and community cooperation were essential for survival. The seventh day ended with the survivor communities stronger and more unified than ever before, having transformed from desperate refugees into the architects of humanity's future. They had learned that survival was not just about avoiding death, but about preserving hope, maintaining dignity, and building something better from the ruins of what they had lost. The infected hordes that had once seemed invincible now appeared as a manageable threat that could be contained and eventually eliminated through sustained effort and intelligent strategy. Most importantly, the survivors had discovered that the human spirit was far more resilient than they had ever imagined, capable of adapting to any challenge and finding ways to thrive even in the darkest circumstances, ensuring that their species would not only survive but emerge stronger from the trial that had tested the very foundations of their civilization.